With the Qing Dynasty. In 1644, there's going to be a peasant revolt that challenges Ming rule. It was led by a minor course official named Li Zicheng. This is him here. He conquered the Ming capital at Beijing, and he established his own dynasty. It was called the Shun Dynasty, but this only lasts a year because Li Zicheng, even though he was able to conquer the Ming rule, he is not really an experienced ruler, and the Manchus, who lived northeast of the Ming Chinese, take advantage of the fact that Beijing had just been sacked. They take advantage of the fact that Li Zicheng is not really that experienced of a leader, and they oust Li Zicheng. They have him killed, and then in 1644, so basically it's less than a year after Li Zicheng, they overthrow him and they proclaim the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty was the last imperial dynasty in China, so it lasts until 1911, and then after that you're no longer ever going to have dynastic rule in China. And the Qing Dynasty really marks an unprecedented expansion of China's connection to the outside world. And in a lot of ways this negatively affects China, particularly with the Opium Wars in the 19th century. It also exposes China more towards imperial control, which is devastating for China well into the World War II period. So basically, Manchurians start to move into China after the Qing Dynasty takes control. They try to take advantage of the new lands. It takes about 40 years, but the Manchus eventually pacify China, and they rule in relative stability for about 250 years. So let's talk about the characteristics of the Qing Dynasty. One thing that's important, if you think about what the Ming Dynasty did, you know how the Mings were trying to get rid of all Mongol influence. The same thing's happening with the Qing Dynasty. They're just trying to establish more Manchu traditions over the traditional Han Chinese people. So the Manchu were more ethnically and culturally distinctive from the Mings. They actually arguably were less tolerant than Mongol leaders. They resolved to make their culture dominant in China. So some of the rules that they establish, they disallow marriage between Ming and Qing Chinese people. You see up here that men were obligated to style themselves in the traditional Manchu way. This is the more traditional Ming hairstyle for men, where they wore it up in a bun. And then under the Qing Dynasty, they had to wear their hair in braided pigtails, and they had to shave the top of their heads. If they didn't actually wear their hair this way, they could be executed. And then you see here, and we can discuss this when the time comes, but there's more of a westernization of hair once you get into the more modern rule of China. Same thing happens with women. You do see a change in style. These two women here on the left represent Ming fashion, and then here is Qing Dynasty, which is more Manchu traditional style of dress. What's interesting is there was a brief period to try to stop foot binding practices in China, because Manchu women did not do that. But the problem is that it was such an ingrained tradition, and even though the Manchus try to establish their traditions, there were still so many traditional Chinese people from Han descent living there that they could not successfully ban foot binding. After about a year, the ban on foot binding was rescinded. Another thing that the Qing do to try to maintain control over the government is that they put their own people in top positions of government. So, they're trying to keep all former Ming leaders out. You're actually going to find that a lot of former Ming officials end up getting expelled from the capital and live in relative isolation. And other things, they do maintain, there is some continuity here. The Qing, for example, maintained the bureaucracy that was strengthened under the Ming Dynasty. They also maintained civil service exams. So the main difference then is that, okay, they still have the bureaucracy, they're just having more Manchu people actually occupy those important political positions. So over time, especially, as society sort of reestablishes itself, as the population gets settled, you're going to have some, but not all Chinese people accept the Qing Dynasty as the legitimate rulers of China. So some notable rulers in China, you have Emperor Kangxi. He ruled from 1661 until 1722. He was one of China's longest reigning emperors. His rule marked a period of stability and expansion in China. So you can see here on this map below, under Kangxi, we have China gain Taiwan, whoops, and it also gains part of Mongolia, both inner and outer Mongolia. It also gains parts of Central Asia, so it's pushing quite far out here. It also imposes a protectorate over Tibet. And actually its protectorate policy over Tibet is still reflected in China's treatment of Tibet today, which to a certain extent is at least trying to establish sovereignty, but is also very much held accountable to Chinese policy. They also had control over Nepal, as you can see, so Nepal was a tributary state. There were some limitations, though. They had some of these places pay tribute to China, but they were never actually incorporated into the emperor. Kangxi had a really interesting relationship with Christians. At the point of the Qing Dynasty, we know that there was more contact between the Western world and the Eastern world. He sort of had a mixed policy towards Christian missionaries. So in the early stages, he actually showed great tolerance towards them, and hundreds of thousands of Chinese people actually converted to Roman Catholicism. The missionaries that were treated the best in China were the Jesuits. This is because they showed great respect for Chinese society. While they were there, they learned how to speak and write in the Chinese language. They dressed in the traditional Chinese style. So you can see here these Jesuit missionaries are actually wearing silk robes. They had a high regard for Confucian education. And also the Christian missionaries were well educated themselves, and they could teach the Chinese advances of European science. And so there was this sort of friendly relationship for a period of time. But a controversy arises later about whether Chinese people who converted to Catholicism could still take part in traditional Confucian ceremonies as well as ancestor worship. Pope Clement rules in on this, and he actually issues a ban on the continuation of Chinese rites. So he basically says if you become Christian, you can no longer maintain any Chinese traditional practices. Emperor Kangxi responds to Pope Clement's ban by banning Christian missions in China. He argues that Christian missions are causing too much trouble. So by the time Kangxi's rule comes to an end, you're going to see a little bit more of an antagonistic relationship between Christians and the Chinese imperial government. At the same time, though, you still had a really large contingent of Catholics in China. They just increasingly worshipped in secret. Kangxi had a reputation of being the most learned emperor of all of Chinese history. Of course, you could debate that, but he was a scholar and poet. He urged the building of schools throughout his rule, and there were two really important publications that were made when he was ruling. He authorized the compilation of the Kangxi Dictionary, and that was a book that contained over 42,000 Chinese characters, and it became the standard Chinese dictionary of the 18th and 19th centuries. So it had a long-standing continuity into the present and very much helped develop the more modern Chinese language. He also sponsored the collection of books, and that was comparable to Diderot's encyclopedia that we know was a huge contribution to the Enlightenment era in Europe. So basically, there's this attempt to gather and consolidate knowledge that is very prominent under Kangxi's rule. So the second important Qing emperor that we need to discuss is Emperor Qinglong. He ruled from 1736 to 1795, and like Kangxi, he was also a poet. He was very knowledgeable in art and calligraphy, and he worked to ensure that the government was well administered. When he was ruling, his bureaucracy was very efficient. Tax collections were at an all-time high, and he also attempts to lead military campaigns west of China to try to expand borders, and he's largely successful in that. When Qinglong is ruling China, you see its massive expansion. They annexed Xinjiang province, which is the farthest western portion of China. This is actually where many Uyghurs live. So you're going to find that even though they annexed Xinjiang province, this is accompanied by mass killings of the local Uyghur population. And we even find, as far as continuity is concerned, some parts of Xinjiang province are still really troubled today. The Uyghur population, they're Muslim, they are not Han Chinese at all. They're still not fully incorporated into the rest of Chinese culture. And as China continues to expand, there have been some, development projects out in Xinjiang province to try to get Han Chinese people to move and work in these regions, but the Uyghurs push back. And so it's a good example of a group of outsiders that live in China that are still struggling for sovereignty. The same kind of thing happens in Tibet, which has been a protectorate of China since the Qing Dynasty rather. And Emperor Qinglong actually sent armies into Tibet. He installed the Dalai Lama on the throne there. Also, Qinglong sent a campaign into Nepal, and he forced them to submit to Chinese rule and pay tribute to China. One area where Qinglong was limited was his campaigns in Burma and Vietnam. He did exact some tribute from them, but at the same time, his attempts to conquer them were really unsuccessful and costly. You could say part of that was because it's a much less forgiving climate. The people that are indigenous to this region are very skilled in guerrilla tactics. So what's going to happen is, because they attempt to expand into Burma and Vietnam and don't have much success, this is going to empty the empire's treasury. And so these economic problems they experience is actually going to lead to a little bit more of an opening of the door to European trade. They have insufficient funds, and so they start trading with Europe because they know that, ever since the days of Zheng He, they're very much aware that European and Middle Eastern markets are in high demand for Chinese goods. So you're going to have the Qing Dynasty sell limited trading privileges to European powers. They do try to confine them to one trade location. It was Guangzhou, which is also known as Canton. The British, though, were not satisfied with this. They tried to get greater trading privileges. So under King George III, the British demanded to have more trading rights. Emperor Qinglong responded harshly back to George III, and he wrote a letter to George III that said that the Chinese had no need for British manufactured goods. So essentially what we see is that the Chinese still have that Zheng He-like attitude where they're willing to open up their products for other societies to buy, but they don't want to buy anybody else's. And this is at least sort of the trading pattern for a long time, but finally, or for better or for worse, the European powers are going to find something that the Chinese cannot resist. And in the 19th century, you're going to have the introduction of opium to the trade network. And this is going to be something that, despite the imperial attempt to ban it, is going to be in high demand in China. And it's going to lead to the Opium Wars, which are very destructive for China's relationship with the outside world. But we're actually going to talk about the Opium Wars in the next period of history. Okay, Qinglong, towards the end of his reign, it's characterized by a lot more corruption. The bureaucracy itself started to levy very high taxes on the people, and so that was a huge sign of corruption there. And you can see the epitome of the corruption in that there was a rebellion in the late 18th, early 19th century called the White Lotus Rebellion. And so this was a group of peasants that got together and formed the White Lotus Rebellion, and they were protesting against high taxes, and they also wanted there to be a restoration of Ming rule. And so you can see that peasants were very much unhappy with the outside Manchus ruling them, and they felt that they experienced better positions when they were ruled by the Ming. But the Qing government suppresses the White Lotus Rebellion, and records show that approximately 100,000 peasants were killed in the White Lotus Rebellion. There are going to be more economic changes that we need to address in the Qing Dynasty. One is that there's an interesting development with regard to agriculture versus industry. During the Qing Dynasty, you could call China a proto-industrial society. So in other words, they are maybe starting to work on some limited types of production. So you do have a lot of silk factories, for example. But for the most part, the vast majority of Chinese people still worked on farms. So that's essentially what we think about as proto-industrial. It's like pre-industrial. So, you see here, this is an artist rendering of women on silk looms. But for the most part, the traditional Chinese person you would see working on a farm, right? So China does start to experience more and more of a land shortage as its population grew. And the government tried to rectify this by setting laws that limited the amount of land that people could own. Another huge change in the Chinese economy is that it starts to export a lot more. And you can see that's also a result of the limited funds that the Qing Dynasty is facing after some of its failed military campaigns. So China's increasingly exporting items like obviously silk, but they're also exporting tea and porcelain to markets in Europe and India because they're in very high demand there. The thing, though, is that they're mainly purchasing, that Europeans are mainly purchasing these goods for, with silver because China had little interest in importing goods. The demand for silk from outside countries does lead to the creation of many more silk workshops. And so this actually is going to make it so that former peasants are going to increasingly turn to working in silk workshops for wages. And so we're going to have a shift a little bit away from the more agrarian society, so that's hence the proto-industrial description there. The empire also institutes a tax on traded goods, and that's going to increase its wealth overall, because ultimately there's going to be this, they're going to discourage imports from coming in, but continue to encourage exports. In terms of Chinese society, you are still going to have a pretty strict adherence to Confucianism. So just as a recap, that honors the family above the individual. You do have several generations of families live in the same household. Under Confucianism, there's very much a reverence for older generations. You're also going to have groups of extended families bonded to clans, and that helped maintain social stability there. One of the things about Qing society is that women are not going to really experience any better social standing than they did in the Ming Dynasty. So formal education, for example, was restricted only to men. Women were not allowed to seek a divorce. If you were widowed, there would be significant pressure placed on you not to remarry. And actually, if you were a widow and you committed suicide after your husband died, you would be honored after your death. As I said earlier, there was an attempt in the Qing government to ban foot binding, but that was such a popular practice under the Ming Dynasty that that ban did not work. So foot binding continued. And by the way, foot binding remains a practice until the 19th century when the Qing Dynasty fails. And even after that, there was still foot binding that continued well into the 20th century. It was just in more rural regions where the government had less oversight. Okay, 2 more slides here. Talking about literature in both the Ming and Qing Dynasty. So just a few examples of literature. In the 1590s, Journey to the West was published, and this is a fictional version of Xuanzang's pilgrimage to the Buddhist sites in India. So it shows you at a fairly early period that there was cross-cultural interaction between China and the West. This book in the center was called The Golden Lotus. It was published in 1610. This was written by Lanling Xiao Jiang, and it was considered China's first realistic novel. And then the book on the right is The Dream of the Red Chamber. That was published in 1791. It was written by Cao Zhuiqin, and it was a romance novel about life among 18th century aristocracy. It was written in the Chinese vernacular based on Mandarin Chinese. So that is, a group of languages that was spoken in northern and southwestern China. As far as art is concerned, in the Ming Dynasty, you can see through the art that there was an attempt, again, to establish more traditional Chinese cultures, right? They were trying to get away from the Mongol control. And so some classic examples of Ming art, you have sort of a more realistic representation of the subject matter of the art. They emulated styles of the southern Song dynasty, which was the dynasty that was in place before the Mongol Yuan dynasty. Increasingly, in Ming art, you see this example of the blue and white pottery here, and this was in high demand among Middle Eastern and European markets. So you also, if you ever go to museums that show East Asian art, this pattern of Ming China is really popular. It's just something that Westerners have always been fascinated with. When you move on to the Qing Dynasty, you're going to have some artists that are called traditionalists. This is an example of traditionalist art up here. This was a more creative interpretation of past models of art, so they're sort of taking Ming models, but a lot of times they're a little bit more colorful in nature, a little bit more figurative in nature, so a lot of less detail, a little bit less realistic looking than the Ming style. But what you find also is that there's another style of art called individualist. And individualist art actually came from a lot of former Ming subjects. Remember that when the Qing established their rule, they basically supplanted former Ming rulers with Qing rulers. And so you're actually going to have a lot of Ming former bureaucrats and other subjects have to leave Beijing after the Ming Dynasty fell. A lot of them just go farther south and settle in Nanjing, which was the southern capital in the Ming Dynasty. And actually, a lot of people that moved to Nanjing still maintain a pretty close connection with Jesuit missionaries. So you're actually going to have a lot of Western influence over the art as well. Because individualists were sort of removed from Beijing society, they didn't have access to past models of art. And so a lot of times individualist artists are actually drawing their influence from surrounding scenery, hence the birds, the trees, right? So you do see a little bit of a diversion in art styles. So that is an overview of the Ming and Qing dynasties. This is going to allow us to do a lot more document analysis in class. You basically have the lecture and the information down. So have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you in class on Monday.